A new investigation highlights how Guatemalan migrants are funding their journeys to the U.S. border. According to the Washington Post, migrants are paying for their trips by taking out small loans from some of Guatemala's most popular banks.
Now, those banks have been financed and backed by both the U.S. government and the World Bank.
So joining us now from Mexico City is Latin American correspondent for the Washington Post, Kevin Sieff. Thank you so much for joining us about this, because I think that you often do see these migrants, right? And we hear about these exorbitant fees that they're being charged to make it to the border. And you do wonder, how are they paying for this, right? So explain to us how the money goes from the U.S. government to the pocket of a migrant.
Right. I mean, as you say, the amount of money it now costs to travel to the U.S. border from Guatemala is massive, right? I mean, we're talking about anywhere from $8,000 to $15,000. And so the question that we asked when we started our reporting was, how do some of the poorest people in Central America afford to pay these massive sums of money to human smugglers? And really the answer to that is this sort of system of credit that has developed over the course of the last, really the last 20 years. And one of the ways in which people borrow money in Guatemala is they go to big banks or to microfinance organizations, and they'll say they want to build a home, or they want to get some money for a business. And instead of using that money for the purpose that they stated, they use it to pay for a smuggler that will take them to the United States. What I learned in my reporting is that, in fact, these banks and these microfinance organizations that migrants use to borrow money have, for many years, received support from the U.S. government, from the World Bank, from various development organizations across the world. In fact, some of them would not exist if not for USAID, if not for the World Bank. And so there's this irony, of course, right now where we have the U.S. government is actively trying to stop migration from Guatemala, which over the last year was the biggest source of migration to the U.S. border. And in fact, the reason why some people are able to migrate is because of financial institutions that were themselves started with the U.S. government's support.
So, explain that a little bit more. What was the original intention of the U.S. giving money to Guatemala?
Right. So, microfinance, as many of your viewers probably know, sort of is this idea that if you give people in the developing world small loans, they can use those loans to start a business, make a profit that will then sort of help their family get out of poverty. And this has worked all over the world. It's in many places been a massive success. The problem, at least in Guatemala, is that there is a lack of oversight. So financial institutions give large amounts of money to people in rural Guatemala without really knowing where that money is going to be spent. And so, in fact, this can be a very useful development tool. The problem is the way it's being used. Not only does it, in many cases, lead to increased migration, which of course is at odds with what the U.S. government is trying to do, but it also predicates sort of people's financial success on their ability to successfully migrate to the U.S. And so, one of the biggest tragedies of all this is that people who will take these loans, but if they get to the U.S. border and are then deported, they return owing $10,000, $15,000 with a massive interest rate. And so that then leads to homelessness, displacement, this massive cycle of debt that people really can't get out of for their entire lives. And so what we saw is sort of this well-intentioned development tool that was meant to help people get out of poverty, which in many cases does, but used in this sort of really perilous way that often leads people instead in much deeper poverty.
Has it contributed to the price of being smuggled, if you will, going up? Often when there's more money available, then the price just gets higher.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think suddenly we see people all across rural Guatemala who, because of this system of credit, are able to afford a $10,000 or $15,000 journey. So smugglers can say, sure, I'm going to charge $12,000 or $15,000. It sort of, just perpetuates this really, really costly cycle of migration. The other point that I should make is that, my story focused on the sort of the financial institutions behind the system of credit and behind the migration. But alongside the formal financial institutions, there's also this informal financial network. So, you can go, you're looking for $12,000 to migrate with your family. you can find someone in your neighborhood, whether it's a cousin or a friend of a friend, who is aware enough of how the system works that they're willing to give you a big loan. And so it's sort of this parallel system that looks a lot like formal microfinance, but in fact is informal. But again, it's the same idea. It just gives people the ability to borrow massive amounts of money to do something that is very difficult. Getting across the U.S. border is very, very hard to do, especially now. It's a lot harder now than it was even 8 months ago. And so we're seeing a lot more people who think that they're making a sort of logical financial decision for their family and borrowing this money, but instead end up deported just in an unimaginably huge financial hole. And frankly, they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to get out of it.
How has the U.S. responded to this USAID?
So, I mean, USAID is very clear that they, especially under the Trump administration, are not. I mean, they're not spending a lot of money on international development in Central America, and so they're not currently supporting, at least directly supporting, this kind of microfinance in Guatemala. But the problem is that it's sort of too late. I mean, these organizations already exist. They exist because USAID in the 80s and 90s decided to create organizations like this. And again, there's no problem with microfinance in and of itself. But now that the organizations exist, they're sort of self-sustaining in a way. I mean, they charge, in some cases, 100% interest a year, and so they're profitable. They're profitable on their own without USAID support. And that's really problematic because what they're doing, of course, perpetuates the cycle of debt and of migration. But USAID is not currently supporting these organizations, and I think it's quite concerned that these organizations are doing what we described.
So, Kevin, just one last question. When I go to the bank because I want a mortgage on a house, I need to provide all this documentation to prove that the house exists, that it's not falling apart, that it's worth the money that I'm asking for. You mentioned that there's very little oversight, so I presume a lot of that paperwork they don't ask for. But also, I presume that the banks that aren't providing this sort of financing, that actually say are providing mortgages, they must ask for that paperwork. In other words, there must be financial institutions that are following these sort of guidelines. And so is it just these institutions that are kind of flouting what is usually a standard way of avoiding giving out money and having it sort of float away?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of financial institutions involved in this, and they all have sort of different accountability measures, and they're not all equally sort of irresponsible when it comes to loaning money. I mean, one thing I should say is, like, it is incredibly striking when you enter these villages in northern Guatemala, and it's remarkable how everywhere you go there are billboards advertising credit and loans and microfinance. I mean, the industry has absolutely exploded, and within the industry, there are some banks that are more responsible than others when it comes to making these loans. But I think the reality is, and I talk to a lot of people who work in these banks, who work for these microfinance organizations. I mean, when a family comes into your office and asks for a $10,000 loan in this part of Guatemala, there's a very, very good chance that they're using that money to migrate. And so, yes, they may show you some paperwork that suggests that they're going to use it to start a. I talked to one guy who showed paperwork saying that he was going to start a little mechanic shop. But of course, that wasn't his idea. It's sort of this both sides know how the money will be spent. And there's just a willingness to look the other way, because if you're charging 100% interest a year and you're getting that money, that's a pretty profitable enterprise, especially in rural Guatemala. And the migrant, of course, is willing to pay because they're looking, they have friends or family in the U.S. who've managed to, multiply their income by 10 or 12 times just by migrating. And so for them, it's worth the risk. So both sides are sort of knowingly entering into this agreement that is incredibly risky, at least for the migrant, but also potentially very profitable for the migrant, and certainly profitable for the microfinance organization or for the bank that's looking at a massive interest rate. And ultimately, I mean, for the bank, they're getting the deed to the person's home as a sort of backstop. And so even if the migrant isn't able to pay that money back, in cash, they're going to lose their home, right? And so the bank enters into this agreement knowing that this potentially could lead to homelessness or displacement. But financially, it makes sense for them because they really can't lose. And because we're talking about a sort of financial interaction that's happening in Guatemala, I mean, the reality is there's very little government oversight here. These financial institutions can basically do what they want without the concern of sort of legal action.
All right, Kevin Sieff, thank you very much for your reporting. We appreciate it. Really interesting.